Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, July 26th. Well, what a week it's been. On Sunday, President Joe Biden dropped a bombshell on social media declaring that he would no longer run for a second term. And within 24 hours, Vice President Kamala Harris all but looked like the certain nominee of the Democratic Party for the president and the race that is to come. So, what impact does this sea change in American politics have on the race itself? And how is it all being viewed from abroad? Then, a deeply unpopular Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, came to Washington to deliver a boisterous speech more akin to a State of the Union address than the kind of speech you would expect from a foreign leader on American soil. Netanyahu yesterday met with both Biden and Harris, and today meets with Donald Trump. How will his visit play out in the United States and in Israel? Finally, a big story not in Washington. A blitzkrieg trip by Secretaries Blinken and Austin to Asia in the next 10 days, meant to solidify the alliances that have been built up and strengthened over the last few years. How will the countries in Asia, both our allies and countries that are not, react to the visit? Here to talk about these issues are three reporters who cover these stories. Susan Glasser, staff writer of The New Yorker. Karen Moriyasu, Washington correspondent for Nikkei Asia. And Prashant Rao, senior editor at Semaphore. Good morning, all. Good afternoon, Prashant. You're in London. Wonderful to have all of you. Susan, sometimes they say a week is a long time in politics, and sometimes it's a decade goes by in just this week. This seems to be, at least the last few weeks, seems to have been just stunning when it comes to American politics. And it's just hard to absorb. Tell us sort of what's happened and where do you think this race is now, and how does it change sort of the way people are starting to think about it?
Yeah, that's right, Ivo. Today actually marks 1 month since that debate that proved to be the undoing of Joe Biden's presidency. And, in the history books, I think there is a very real chance that it can be the month that changed the world. We don't know the outcome yet. I think it's important to stipulate from the front end here that this remains a very close race and is almost certain to remain a very close race right up until the end, because that's the reality of America today, is that we're contesting this battleground in a very, very small number of states with a very, very small number of voters. But with that being said, the reset of the campaign for Democrats is something that they tried and failed to do with months with Biden. It couldn't succeed in the end. That's why we had this remarkable, really uniting of Democratic leaders behind the scenes to push him out. And, his speech the other day didn't quite come out and say that. But of course, that is what happened. It's a remarkable thing in American politics. It really hasn't happened in any of our lifetimes. And so we're without a script to a certain extent. But I think that it does have very real foreign policy implications, national security implications, as well as political implications. That transition from Biden to Harris, there are a fair number of question marks, but she's a different person from a different political generation with a different experience and outlook. And I think that would result in some concrete changes were she to become the president in Biden's stead, either winning the election or because he doesn't end up serving the full term. The first and foremost is that Harris is generationally different. And Biden has spent decades immersed in a kind of vision of 20th century transatlanticism as the former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Before he served 2 terms as vice president, we've seen very clearly that's his orientation. He has a perspective that he often echoes the rhetoric of the World War II era into which he was born and the post-war Cold War in which he came to his adulthood. He uses terms about the conflict between democracies and autocracies that very explicitly reminds you of the language that FDR used in the early days of World War II. He has a bedrock view about alliances and about the need to confront Russia and China that comes also from those experiences. And he has a confidence. The other part of this, right, is psychological. There's such power vested in the Oval Office. And you, Ivo, have seen that firsthand in your roles inside government. But the psychological part is that Joe Biden had this supreme confidence in himself and his judgment as a foreign policy leader, watching Obama for 8 years, how he would have done things differently if it was Biden and not Obama in that chair. I think Biden himself really shaped a lot of the controversial decisions around foreign policy in this presidency, whether it was demanding adamantly the withdrawal from Afghanistan on his terms and not reevaluating, how to do that, whether it was his extreme caution once he did decide to support Ukraine after the Russian invasion. A lot of the decisions around what weapons to send, how not, how worried he was around what he called the prospect of World War III. Those things came, in my view, from Biden's long experience as a foreign policy leader who was going to be the decider. And I don't think we know how Harris would be in that situation, but I think she would be different, perhaps more likely to listen to staff and expertise, at least initially, certainly less visceral in her foreign policy worldview than he is. I'll stop there, but I think we can't understate what a big deal this is.
Yeah, no, and I think I think your distinction between the generational one and sort of the steeping in one sense of one's confidence versus, not that she's not confident, but just comes out of a different experience than Joe Biden is very apt. Ken, let sort of, how has this been seen? And I know you're in Washington, and you're reporting about Washington back home, but you're also looking at what's happening back home in Japan and other places. And when you talk to your fellow foreign correspondents in Washington, how are people reacting to this, and what do they see the impact will be on sort of America's role in the world and how people view America?
Right. Thanks, Ivo. It's really interesting to talk to the foreign embassies in Washington. Every country has the same issue, be it Japan or China. And it's that each embassy has a political section. None of the people in the political section were watching Kamala Harris. I went to the Chinese embassy last night, and I talked to somebody in the political section. They said they were focused on Governor Newsom of California. They had people looking at his statements and what he might bring in 2028. Nobody was looking at Kamala Harris. So they're scrambling to go through all her past statements and trying to think of who might be her national security advisor or secretary of state if she does become president. So that's going on in the Chinese embassy, but it's also going on in the Japanese embassy and the Korean embassy and the Singapore embassy. So that's happening right now. From Japan's standpoint, the discussion is, what would a Harris administration be different from a Trump-Vance administration? And I think there are two immediate changes that are clear. One is that if it is a Trump-Vance administration, Robert Lighthizer is probably going to have a very prominent role, maybe Treasury Secretary. He has advocated for a weaker dollar. So that is very different from the strong dollar, weak yen that we are seeing now. Whether that's good for Japan or not, there are many takes on that. But that's an immediate difference. Also, I think what's interesting with the choice of Vance is that the Republican side has really focused on a foreign policy for the working man, not for Wall Street, not for globalists, but really the domestic politics and foreign politics are one and the same, and every foreign policy decision will be decided in the context of what this means for the American worker. Now, the Biden administration also has this slogan of a foreign policy for the middle class. But there is a difference, because I think in the Biden administration, there's two pillars. One is a foreign policy for the middle class, but the other pillar is taking care of its allies and partners. And these two pillars, it's not much talked about, but they're very contradictory. You cannot take care of your allies, but also pursue a foreign policy that focus is just on your middle class. And in the Biden administration, I think the focus was more on strengthening allies and partnerships and to rebuild America's stance in the world. That has been more prominent. I think, Trump-Vance administration, the allies and partners are not that important. There'll be more focus on the middle class. So that's a big difference. Finally, on Kamala Harris, yes, she'll be a continuation of the Biden administration, but I very much agree with Susan. There is a difference. For instance, Biden, on 4 occasions, said that America will come to Taiwan's defense militarily if there is a Chinese invasion. Whether Harris can say that is very questionable because it needs quite a strong conviction and understanding of all the past communiques and the laws. Also, I think the fact that Biden spent many hours when he was vice president with Xi Jinping, traveling across China, traveling across America, and that kind of trust enables him to say with conviction, this is the case. I'm not quite sure that Kamala Harris can say that. So that's my take for now.
That's great. I think that the Chinese embassies and others would be well advised to listen more to people like Susan Glasser, then they wouldn't have made the mistake to think that Newsom was going to be the person coming there. But that wasn't high on anybody's list. But that's kind of interesting. Prashant, you're in London, so you're actually observing this from your foreign spot. What's the reaction in London? And more importantly, of course, Semaphores is all over the world. How are people reacting to this, and what are they seeing as the implication?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Ken said, actually, the sense of whether Harris was expected or not expected. I think there's a lot of scrambling to find out what it is she believes. How much of what she has said in the past 3.5 years was as a vessel for the Biden administration, and how much of it is what she actually believes. The critical questions will be over issues to do, Israel and Gaza. Her, remarks last night were, probably in keeping with one she had made in the last 6 months, but I think that had been an open question. Was she a release valve for the administration, which was, facing increasing domestic kind of frustration from progressive voters, or was this actually kind of her own kind of sensibility? And I think we're going to see this more on all of these issues. Every time she makes a remark on foreign policy, she obviously did not have a long career in the Senate before becoming vice president, and so there isn't a huge amount of public statements on foreign policy that are absent of the vice presidency, and disaggregating the vice presidency from her personal beliefs is something I think we're going to have to parse in the next sort of few months. And that'll be, I think, very interesting. And certainly a lot of people I talk to here, and, the press is very focused on what is it that Harris believes. Ivo, you were at the Munich Security Conference, and, read from a few people. I'm curious what you think. Was she didn't give the most impressive speech in Munich, sort of last year in 2023. And when she came to London for the Artificial Intelligence Security Conference, also, the folks here were not terribly impressed by her. And of course, Politico had this story from a few weeks ago, about a week ago, about how an ECB policymaker got caught on a hot mic saying that she's invisible in Europe. And so I think there are some open questions about Kamala Harris and her foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, Susan, I'd love to just sort of get your take on this. Is the hard thing of being a vice president to a president who is a foreign policy star. I mean, I think and came to the presidency in that way. Star is the wrong word. Deeply confident in his own abilities, as you said, Susan. Just like George H.W. Bush and Dan Quayle, although I wouldn't want to compare the two, but Dan Quayle's purpose was not to do foreign policy, and clearly Kamala Harris's was to stand in, but not to really do foreign policy. How do you see that, and what would you suggest that people look at to understand where she's likely to come from if she were elected?
Yeah, I think that's right. Again, that's why I emphasize the questions around her decision making and psychology, because in the end, whether you have a lot of experience like Joe Biden or very little experience like Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, then it's about who you are, what your worldview is, where you come from, what your advisors are, who you lean on, and how you make decisions. And, both Ivo and I know very well, actually, Phil Gordon, who is her national security advisor, who is absolutely, first-rate product of many important roles in Washington. Phil has spent a lot of time working both the Middle East for the Obama administration and more to the point, Europe. He is a Europeanist. He traveled with her to those various, she's gone to Munich multiple times. I think there is an evolution that we've seen in her comfort level making these international trips. And that's important, right? So she has a lot more experience now than she did 4 years ago. She wasn't making these decisions. What she has is the experience of being in the room for the kind of decision-making process. One call it an advantage or a critique of the Biden administration, like the Obama administration before, is that it's been very process intensive in terms of very bureaucratic, in terms of its decision making around foreign policy. The rap on the Biden administration, or in particular the rap on the Obama administration, but to a lesser extent the Biden administration, is that Democrats lean too hard into the, sort of painstaking, almost micromanagement of decisions, that they've been very labor intensive. Well, Harris has seen that. She has a sense of how that decision making works. So it'll be very interesting to see if she wants to come in and change that. First of all, she's a lawyer. She's a careful lawyer by all accounts. That means she may have an approach like that. She may be kind of like Obama in coming to these decisions around the process and what the system is putting up to her. I think her advisors will be very important in that respect. I do want to address, so I think it's a little bit unknown, but basically she's not going to come in with a big agenda of changing America's footprint in the world. And that's the most important top level takeaway. She is a liberal internationalist, in my view. She is not going to be highly identified with the extreme of her party, which, like the extreme of the Republican Party today, has a kind of look inward, pull back from this kind of engagement in the world. I think that Harris is not from that part of the party. I think she is more of an internationalist. But I want to address what Ken said just quickly about Trump and Vance, because I think this goes also to the Harris question. I think that if these embassies are once again misreading things and thinking that J.D. Vance is going to play a big role in any kind of policy, never mind in foreign policy in the Trump administration, that would be a mistake. They should not think that. Having written a whole book on the Trump administration when he was in the White House, and one that focused actually a lot on the national security and foreign policy piece, Donald Trump didn't give two hoots what Mike Pence thought about foreign policy, and he doesn't care what J.D. Vance thinks probably about not only foreign policy, but about anything. And if you want to know what the Trump second term is going to be like, guys, do the work. Study the first term. Donald Trump is a 78-year-old man who is not only not going to change, but whatever his preconceptions are, they're going to get more pronounced and worse. What is he talking about on the campaign trail? Even though it's not politically beneficial to him, listen to his rallies. He is bragging about his great relationships with the dictators of the world. That is Donald Trump's foreign policy. It doesn't matter what J.D. Vance thinks. He does not have a foreign policy for the middle class. He does not have a foreign policy for the working class. Please don't amplify those talking points of the Republicans. They are talking points. They are not a statement of reality. Trump is much more likely to approach it as he did in the first term, as essentially a kind of an oligarchic, corrupt deal maker. That is his approach to foreign policy. And because it's the area where American presidents have so much personal power, it's where we see Trump actually in an even more undiluted form than in domestic policy issues. And that means that he will be erratic. He will be very much likely to be driven by whatever ideas are surrounding him. So it's not irrelevant who he appoints to these jobs. It's definitely relevant. And in fact, that's the reason that so many people are panicked about a Trump second term, because the people who were the constrainers around Trump in the first term, by the way, they were largely on the foreign policy and national security side. They were John Kelly, they were Jim Mattis, they were even to a certain extent both of his secretaries of state. They were the uniformed military. And those are the people who are not going to be surrounding him. And radical voices will be surrounding him, not because he's going to be out there, boldly reorienting American policy for the working class people of Kentucky, who he could not give two hoots about, but because he is much more likely to come into the office and say, well, I would like to make a deal with Saudi Arabia, and here's what I'm willing to give away, and there's not going to be anybody to stop him. So I really think that's really important. There's a lot of confusion and obviously a lot of misunderstanding right now about American politics as the wheels come off of it. But J.D. Vance is not going to be a decision maker in this administration. I think that's one thing we can safely say, even if we don't know a lot about the other stuff.
No, I think that's certainly a good point. The only other point I would add to the Kamala Harris piece is that since 1988, only one person will have come to the presidency with more experience in foreign policy than Kamala Harris, and that was Joe Biden. Everyone, whether it's Bill Clinton or George Bush or Barack Obama or Donald Trump, were novices when it came to foreign policy. She will have had 4 years as a vice president. That, by definition, just to emphasize Susan's point about being in the room matters, and meeting with foreign leaders matters, because that's a kind of experience that takes time. And is as unique as a vice president that only a president can equal. And that's why Bush and Biden, Bush 41 and Biden, are the two people who came more prepared to the job. In some ways, Prashant, let's shift talking about somebody being deeply steeped in politics and foreign policy. The Prime Minister of Israel was in town. The first time since October 7 that he was in Washington. In fact, I think the first time since he was in the United States, to deliver a address in Congress, and of course, meeting with the president, the vice president, and today, Donald Trump. What did you take away from what he was trying to achieve, and how did it play?
So first, just a bit of trivia that is probably widely known in Washington now is that Benjamin Netanyahu has now delivered more joint addresses to Congress than Winston Churchill, and has overtaken him with 4, I believe.
He did mention that. He did mention that quite a bit. Yeah.
But that does speak to just his longevity. It cannot be overstated, right? This is now sort of almost 30 years that he has been kind of involved in American politics, let alone Israeli politics. And that was, I think, one of the takeaways from this was an intensely political speech. You alluded to this in your introduction. This was not something we would have expected from a foreign leader. It was combative. It was, all the things actually that we know Netanyahu to be as a leader of his country and in diplomatic circles. So to some degree, that wasn't unexpected. I think I listened to the BBC interviewed a hostage relative who said that this was largely a speech delivered to an Israeli audience rather than an American audience, which I thought was an interesting characterization. In that it was really undergirding everything was the possibility of this hostage and ceasefire deal. I think just the nature of where Netanyahu is currently politically is very much a question as to how much is he playing for November. I think is one of the implicit questions of this entire trip. The fact that he is going down to Florida right now and to meet with former President Trump speaks to this notion. It's widely believed that he is holding off on any potential ceasefire deal because he thinks he'll have a stronger hand to play were Trump to be elected in November. And so, U.S. politics and Israeli politics are a kind of two-way street in which they flow back into and from one another. And that has been the case for a long time. We shouldn't assume this is new. But that was one of my main takeaways from this is just, in the horrific 10 months since that October 7th attack, the strengthening of Netanyahu's public resolve to continue with this war in the face of his own military advisors and many of his civilian advisors speaks, I think, to a political incentive that has driven his decision making, and so we should assume it will. in the sort of weeks and months to come.
I think that's all very well said, and I think that's probably the right way to think about it. I guess the question, Susan, is can he hold out for until November in order to and do you think the pressure on him might start to increase? Clearly, the message from Biden and Harris were ceasefire now, but do you think that pressure is going to be sufficient, or that he can withstand it and just continue to war in the face of the reality that if he doesn't continue to war, he may lose power?
Yeah, Ivo, thank you. I think a couple thoughts. One, Netanyahu at this point is more popular in America among Republicans than he is in his own country. And he gave a very partisan speech, and he has acted as a very partisan actor in American politics recently. That's underscored, obviously, by his visit to the former president today. And, the optics of that speech, which was essentially a Republican dominated audience in the floor of the U.S. House, to listen to him, applauding him again and again and again. I saw somebody say, well, it's like he was the Republican senator from Jerusalem rather than a statesman or a world leader. So that's one observation. Somebody else pointed out that, it's unlikely he could get that reception on the floor of the Knesset in his own country. I don't know that it means anything. I didn't hear him say anything at all in that speech. There was no news in that speech. There was no substance. And if anything, I was struck by the fact that the remarkable timing completely changed the context. Republicans thought this was going to be a brilliant idea, was going to underscore the divisions in the Democratic Party. It was going to offer the good campaign season foil for them of, that they're the ones sticking up for our ally in the Middle East, and Donald Trump is a strongman in the Middle East, and that this was going to be essentially a campaign event that they were using the backdrop of the U.S. Capitol for. Instead, of course, it came within this remarkable week of reset in American politics. And so mostly it got overshadowed. But to the extent that anyone paid attention, rather than underscoring Democratic divisions, it offered Vice President Harris, literally days into her time as the presumptive nominee, this opportunity, to appear as a statesperson on the world stage. She gets her own bilateral meeting separate from the president's with Netanyahu. That's fascinating and very good for her, I think. And then I paid close attention to her remarks when she came out last night after the meeting with Netanyahu. President Biden did not speak to the public after his meeting. But B, Harris came out. She didn't overtly break in any way with American policy. She said that we're still supporting Israel in particular to make sure that there's no distance between us when it comes to countering the threat from Iran in the region. However, her tone was different. Her emphasis was different. She said repeatedly, I'm going to not only call attention to the humanitarian crisis of this war and the plight of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, but I will not be silent. And I think that was a very loud message to the Democratic base. Again, it's a difference in tone and emphasis from what Biden is doing. But for now, it was an artful threading of the needle on an issue that actually has hurt Biden with his own party and with the enthusiasm of many voters that he needs to win in November. So, she'll have to keep addressing it. But instead of being this kind of like campaign rally for Donald Trump, I felt like Netanyahu's visit actually worked out pretty well for Democrats, all things considered.
Yeah, just to that, Susan, I'd love to. I think that's actually right. And there's one other nuance that she stressed both in her public statement and in the statement that was released, which is she actually pointed the finger on who's to blame for what's happening in Gaza. And she blamed Israel. She blamed how the war was conducted as the reason why there is the suffering. And if you go back to Biden's statements, it's we need to deal with the humanitarian and remove, quote, obstacles. But who are putting those obstacles? She's not saying. She said, no, it's the way you conduct the war is part of the problem. And that's, I think, another mess. One, I actually think she deeply believes that. But secondly, will also help on addressing some of the deep concerns within parts of the Democratic Party about about what has been happening over the last 9 months. And I thought that was pretty clever. And at the same time, use the really quite outrageous protests that were happening outside the Capitol in order to condemn those and to make sure that law and order issues were very much uppermost in people's minds. So it turned out to be pretty darn good for her in that sense as well. I think that's actually right, Susan. Ken, how did you look at this, and how did you report it back home?
Right. So I agree with Susan. The fact that Kamala Harris had a separate meeting with Bibi was very interesting. And I totally agree. The way she made the comments to the press after the meeting was very interesting. No smiles, very stern face. She said that Israel has a right. Well, she said she raised money to plant trees in Israel when she was a little girl. That was nice. But she also said that Israel has a right to defend itself, but how it does matters. That's very interesting. Last December, I think it was it Dubai or Doha? In Dubai, Kamala Harris talked about the 5 principles that the Biden-Harris administration has for this Israel issue. And one of those principles is very telling. I think the others are normal, like more forcible displacement, no reoccupation, no reduction of territory, and no using Gaza as a platform for terrorism. But she also said no siege or blockade. The word siege, I think, raised many eyebrows among Middle East watchers. Siege. Since the Gaza disengagement of 2005, the Palestinians have said, the occupation hasn't really ended because there's a siege. Israel controls what comes in and out. So it's an open air prison. And the fact that Harris said no siege was very bold. Biden has written about the no siege in an op-ed to the Washington Post in October last year, but I don't think he has said it himself. So there is a little difference between Biden and Harris, and I think Japan is watching that very carefully. For Japan, and I've said before, Japan really wants America to focus on the Indo-Pacific, and any more flare-ups in the Middle East, in addition to Ukraine, is very problematic, especially if Hezbollah comes into the battle. Then America will probably have to offer Israel Patriot missiles. There's also already talk of Japan providing license-made Patriot missiles. Mitsubishi Heavy makes them in Japan, offering those to America so they can backfill the warehouses because America is providing them to Ukraine and to Israel. But Japan only makes 30 Patriot missiles a year. So, and those are primarily for the Indo-Pacific. But if we start giving those to Ukraine and Israel, that really, it's a zero-sum game. It weakens the deterrence of the Indo-Pacific. So we really don't want the Israel issue to expand. Also, while there's a little contradiction here, while Japan wants America to focus on the Indo-Pacific, if there is turmoil in the Middle East and energy prices are higher, that really hurts everybody in Japan. So we want everything, but we do want peace in the Middle East. But we want America to focus on the Indo-Pacific.
You're not that different. Everybody wants everything. So that's the the difficulty. Prashant, just before we jump to the next issue, I do note there's a change in government in London. And a slightly different view on the Middle East. What's happening there, and it may, in fact, being some announcements coming forward.
Yeah, the UK has withdrawn certain sort of support lines that it had been aligned with the United States on. I think the Labour Party, that's just come into government 3 weeks ago, has a lot of the same political pressures that the Democrats have in the United States to a greater or lesser degree, and that the progressive wing is, quite concerned about British support for Israel. And a lack of voice for the various acts that Israel is committing in Gaza. I think it gets to a bigger point that we've kind of talked about implicitly in this conversation. The politicization of Netanyahu's speech in the United States, and Susan sort of so helpfully kind of described, just like the kind of changing politics of the Democrats were in disarray and now they're united, and vice versa for the Republicans, or sorry, the opposite for Republicans. It does speak, though, to something that, I don't think can be understated, is how politicized Israel has become as an issue in the United States. And that will be one of Benjamin Netanyahu's long-term legacies as prime minister, is that he has now made this a political football in which Israel policy may actually shift between governments in the way it is in Britain. And this is exactly what Israel cannot afford in the region that it is in. And the costs that this will exact over the long term, well after this war is, fought and hopefully ended, and will be this legacy of, as I think was commented a few months ago, that Joe Biden will probably be the last pro-Israel Democratic president of his ilk, and the sort of maybe that was always happening, and this was a long sort of journey, but it has been accelerated over the past 10 months through the conduct of this war and Netanyahu's particular politics and how he has exacted those politics in the years prior. And I think that will also have to be sort of counted when we think of Netanyahu's legacy as a foreign policy leader of Israel.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think pro-Israel, we have to start defining what that really means in this context, and that's part of the Netanyahu legacy. To be pro-Israel, is that means Netanyahu's Israel or a different kind of Israel, and that's I think the other way to put it is that Kamala Harris is probably a lot closer to European views about how to deal with this war than in some ways Joe Biden was, and that the conservatives were an outlier, just like Germany is an outlier for historical reasons, and that you now have an alignment that is that if you are in Israel should be worrying, and at least if you're Netanyahu should be worrying. If she wins, of course, Trump will be back to the other side. Politics, as you said, Prashant, it's a two-way street, Israeli and U.S. politics, and that street is now moving in strange directions, for sure. Ken, in the few minutes we have left, you rightly pointed out when we started talking about what to do this week, a trip that no one is paying attention to except in your region, and we will be paying attention to next week, I'm sure. Tony Blinken going for 11 days to Asia, and Secretary Austin also going a major push of to reemphasize the importance of the Indo-Pacific in American foreign policy, which has kind of been lost because of the Ukraine and Gaza situation, and in some ways American politics. But that's one constant, and the administration is trying to remind people there's a real world out there, and we need to be engaged in it. So how do you read what exactly are they going to do, and how do you read this?
So it's very interesting. You said 11-day trip. It was originally an 11-day trip, but it became a 10-day trip because Blinken delayed his departure by 1 day. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to attend the meeting between Biden and Netanyahu, which kind of reminds everybody that, while the Biden administration has always said Indo-Pacific is our primary concern, no, it's not. The Middle East is. And that the fact that Blinken wanted to be in that meeting between Biden and Netanyahu has impacted this trip, because the first visit on this trip, he's going to Vietnam, Laos, Japan, Philippines, Singapore, and Mongolia. The first visit was to be Vietnam. It was very important because the Vietnam General Secretary Trong passed away, and he was supposed to go to the funeral. And Vietnam, as you know, is considered the swing state of the Indo-Pacific. Whether Vietnam sides with the West or sides with the China kind of will be the deciding factor of how the region looks in the future. And what was really telling, because the US and China both needed to show how important Vietnam was by representing themselves at this funeral, China did not announce who was going until the Americans announced who was going. So the Americans announced Blinken going to the funeral. And then the next day, the Chinese came out with Wang Huning, who is the number 4 in terms of hierarchy. Why Wang Huning? Because Anthony Blinken is the number 5 in America if you look at the presidential line of succession. So China wants to make sure that they send someone higher than America. But because Blinken attended this meeting with Netanyahu, he couldn't attend this funeral. And the US was represented by the ambassador, Mark Napper, instead. Blinken will now go to Vietnam tomorrow on Saturday. The funeral is over, but he will pay respects to the family of the late General Secretary. And today it was announced that this visit will become a presidential delegation with the blessing of Joe Biden to go to this to Vietnam. So a lot of takeaways from that. After that, he's going to Laos to attend the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Regional Forum. He is expected to have a meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi there. That'll be interesting. ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum, is the only international setting that North Korea attends, but apparently there will be no interaction with the North Koreans. Then a very important visit to Japan. As you know, Prime Minister Kishida came to Washington in April for a state visit. That was a very important visit for the alliance, but they have not been able to hold a follow-up meeting to that for the past 4 months. They're finally going to do that. They're going to talk about strengthening command and control and defense industrial cooperation. I talked about the Patriots. They're going to probably agree to ramp up production. They're going to vow that America is going to buy more Patriot missiles from Japan, and that would give clarity to Mitsubishi Heavy to invest more. And then he'll go to the Philippines for another 2+2 with Austin, and they will talk about the South China Sea, and then they go to Singapore and Mongolia. 2 days ago at AEI, the Biden administration's Asia officials all appeared: Mira Cooper, Eli Ratner, and Daniel Crittenbrink. They talked about this trip and what the whole strategy of the Biden administration was towards the Indo-Pacific. Mira Cooper said something very interesting. She said the minilaterals that are forming, the Quad, the US, Japan, South Korea trilateral, US, Japan, Philippine trilateral, all these minilaterals, in her view, ideally 5 years down the road, will interact with each other, sometimes with the US, sometimes even without the US. And they will form a new regional architecture that strengthens the Indo-Pacific in defending the free and open rules-based international order against any challenges, be that China, be that North Korea, or be that climate change. It is very idealistic. I don't know if that's going to happen, but in this world, she envisions China playing by the rules as well. And there will be a balance of power and harmony. And that's what the Biden administration wants. So this new regional architecture is a new concept, and it's very interesting.
Mara Hooper, of course, is the National Security Council Senior Director for East Asia and the Indo-Pacific, and I think that's who you were talking about. It is fascinating, and Susan, I think if you ask somebody in the Biden administration, including or perhaps aside from the president, and ask them what's your biggest foreign policy accomplishment, the building of Indo-Pacific alliances and strengthening those will be high on that list for people like Blinken and Sullivan and others. And in some ways, this is a continuation. But as Ken rightly says, the real world sort of intervenes with the architecture building that's complicated. How do you see this, and how do you see this lasting? What do you see happening in the next administration now that Biden will definitely not be the next president?
Yeah, 3 quick points. Absolutely. The Biden team sees that their focus on alliance and on creating a kind of actual viable network in the Asia Pacific that is taking on China, so that it's not just a kind of zero-sum US versus China Cold War echo. This is the key to their approach. So I think that's important. But the flip side is that, they tend to get enamored of these kind of elaborate, IR theory. It's like they're playing a game of, risk or strategy or something, and that's not necessarily always reflected in the world. In the real world, Joe Biden became a lame duck the second that he posted that announcement on Twitter on Sunday afternoon at 1:46 p.m. And that makes it very, very hard to do anything really monumental in these last few months, whether that is a sweeping Middle East peace deal that they've been chasing without success their whole presidency or the last couple of years, or it's major new developments in regional security in Asia. Just a final quick point, which is what is at stake in the election and what is at risk. Donald Trump is the opposite of an alliance man. And I will tell you that in one of the interviews that we did for our book with Trump in Mar-a-Lago, when we asked him what was the one thing, that he wanted to do in his second term that he didn't have a chance to do, the thing that popped into his head the most quickly was to withdraw troops, U.S. troops from South Korea if he didn't get more money from them, essentially, have them to pay him more to protect them. I don't know why people don't take Trump more seriously on this point. The fantasy football of Republicans going out there in an election season pretending, that they're so tough on China and they're so hawkish and they're so committed to alliances. The attention, I think, to Trump's threats to NATO have obscured the extent to which both Japan and South Korea and others in the region who aren't looking for greater Chinese influence, that they have a lot to be worried about in a Trump second term. And I've been shocked at how little attention that has gotten.
Well, I just add on a Bloomberg interview that he did a few weeks ago. He pulled the alliance football, to use the Charlie Brown analogy, out of the Taiwanese hands too, which led to a collapse of a huge impact on the chip-making industry, stocks in the stock market, because, of course, Taiwan is pretty darn critical to that too. So, to your point, I agree. Prashant, last perspective from you. How do you see the relative balance here that the administration is trying to play in order to make the Indo-Pacific still sort of the core essence of its foreign policy, given everything that's also happening?
Yeah, I guess I don't disagree with anything either Ken or Susan has said. I guess just to try to play the devil's advocate to some degree is, I think there is a secular move in the United States anyway to harden towards China and to sort of increase trade barriers. That has been a kind of persistent theme of this administration and will be certainly a more, a serious sort of priority of the Trump administration. But we should not downgrade how much the United States has imposed trade restrictions on China on really critical industries. Whether you agree or disagree, it's just an incredible sort of policy move that they have made. And secondarily, I guess, I don't mean to justify his comments about Taiwan, but I think if we are to sort of assume that strategic ambiguity remains a priority for the United States, Joe Biden has to some degree rode back strategic ambiguity by, as Ken said earlier on this discussion, 4 times saying he would step in to defend Taiwan. And to some degree, Donald Trump is strategic ambiguity personified. And so is this good? Is it bad? I think we have to sort of assess what it is we hope U.S. foreign policy will accomplish, rather than going in with saying, well, this is what we've done forever. Because again, as Ken pointed out, right, Japan wants peace in the Middle East and cheap oil, and the United States to be everywhere. And this is actually what 197 other countries want from the United States. And I think one of the persistent themes of the past 8, 10, 20 years of American politics is Americans are no longer tolerant of this assumption that the United States will do everything for everyone for an indeterminate period of time. And again, I don't mean this to be a sort of justification of the Trump policy. I just think if we assume that he goes in and he says, well, I won't pay for South Korea's defense. I mean, I think it's worth going in with a good faith analysis of, well, how much longer does the United States pay for all of, do all of these things for an indeterminate amount of time? Is it still, in the business world, they would call it zero-based accounting, right? Or whatever, is the idea that you start again from scratch. What should we be doing in the world? And coming with that approach I think is not an unusual or without merit concept.
I think in part this is what the election in some ways is going to be about, is are we, as Donald Trump put it, an insurance company, or should we do some zero-based analysis, or are we continuing a policy that is lacking in some ways from, that it has more and more people, particularly in the Republican Party, questioning the continued utility of that policy. And that, in part, will be what the debate is about. And we will be here to watch it. And then when we watch it, we will analyze. And I can't think of better people than Susan Glasser of The New Yorker, Prashant Rao of Semaphore, and Ken Moriyasu of Nikkei Asia to do that. So thank you 3 for being part of it. And thank you for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.